I'm going to take a couple minutes to sort of set the stage, explain what's at stake in 5G in the IoT, and then each panelist will take a few minutes to make some remarks in response to some questions I'm going to pose. I'm then going to moderate a debate amongst us and then open the floor to questions. Let me very quickly, I don't know how well you can see this on these monitors. Many of you have seen this slide like this. This is the night. This is the world at night. This is done by the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, and you can see the lit up parts of the globe at night. And what it's basically showing you is the parts of the globe where production takes place. And you'll notice that there's a strong pattern. The United States, Western Europe, Japan, India, China, all strongly lit up, suggesting that what you're seeing is the equilibrium outcome of where production, logistics, and transportation occurs on the globe. Now, wouldn't it be cool if we could look at this in the past? If we had satellites, let's say back in 1500, that would tell us where the world lit up. Well, we don't, but a co-author of mine and I did the next best thing. Because the opportunity cost of my time is very low, we identified all 2,200 cities that have existed in 1900 and then all the way back to 1500, and we geocoded them. And so if you do that, what you're going to see is unfolding in time the parts of the globe that grew economically and the parts of the globe that stagnated. So we're going to recreate the nightlights by geocoding where every city with more than 20,000 people is located. So here's what the world looks like in 1500 with medieval technology. And you'll notice that the most lit up parts in 1500 are India and China, followed by Western Europe. The United States is basically dark. There's one dot. If you squint, you'll see it. It's Nineveh. It's a city, an ancient city, it was an indigenous city in Mississippi. Other than that and Mexico City, the world is pretty dark, except, of course, in part of Africa, you also see there's an area in northern Nigeria, what had been the Songhai Empire. Now let's take a look at 1800, at the world. Has it changed as technology changed? Okay, so we're going to look at the world now before the Industrial Revolution, before the fossil fuel revolution. And if you compare these two, look who gets lit up in 1800, Western Europe. And relatively speaking, if you toggle back and forth, look at China and India. If you toggle back and forth between 1500 and 1800, they get a little brighter, but not relative to Western Europe. And you start to see in the United States a few cities on the eastern seaboard lighting up, places like Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, and Baltimore, of course. And the rest of the world's still pretty dark. Now let's look at 1900. All of a sudden, Western Europe is as brightly lit in 1900, pretty much as it is today. And relative to Western Europe, China and India don't light up. If you go back and forth, China and India get a little brighter, but not by very much. And of course, the United States just pops. And so what you're seeing here is the effect of different property rights systems on long-run economic growth. The difference between 1800 and 1900 is the second industrial revolution. Well, it's the first industrial revolution plus the railroad and the steamship. So you're seeing that the places that adopt strong property rights, including intellectual property rights, but property rights in general, are the places that prosper. And the places that do not prosper as much. So the question before us as a group now, to answer for you and start a debate is, so what's the Earth going to look like in 2100? And the hypothesis I would put before you is that how the Earth's going to look in 2100 is going to be a function of which parts of the globe are able to take advantage of the fourth industrial revolution, that it will be an outcome of 5G and the Internet of Things. It's not a foregone conclusion. Where economic activity will locate both in terms of logistics and in terms of production, will be a function of the institutional ecologies that countries create for those technologies. And so one of the key questions in front of the United States right now is, will we stay lit up relative to the rest of the globe, or will we look like what happened to China and India between 1500 and 1900? I'm now going to throw the floor open to our panelists. There are four questions which I posed. For the sake of time, I won't read them to you because I assume everybody can read. We're going to start with Jorge Padilla, then Cheetam Sharma, then David Teese, then Gordon Chang. Jorge, floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm going to focus on the first question, on the potential role of antitrust policy and regulatory policy for the development and success of IoT, or the extent to which regulatory policy and antitrust may actually represent an obstacle for the success of IoT. But before I do that, I need to say a few things about the IoT value chain. And don't expect too much from me because I'm not an engineer, so I have a limited idea of what is at stake. But as an economist, I'm good at simplifying complex reality. And as an economist, therefore, what I need to understand from the viewpoint of the success of IoT is that this is a multi-layer vertical chain, a vertical value chain, a complex one, where there are many layers. One of the layers, obviously, is the layer of things. But we will also have a communication layers, we will have data layers, applications layers, and eventually processes layers. Now, the important thing about all these layers is that they are complementary. So there is a strong interdependence between these various layers. The value generated by the IoT value chain will depend on the success of each and every one of these layers. Everybody has to invest, everybody has to develop new products, everybody needs to find ways of cooperating with each other, because otherwise the value chain will not succeed. The conditions for success are therefore very clear. First, all layers must invest. They must find optimal to invest. They must have the ability and incentive to invest. Secondly, at each layer, the most efficient technologies need to be selected. And finally, when you take into account all the costs of the different layers and the prices that they charge, the overall price, the total cost of ownership needs to be sufficiently modest that there is high penetration. Those are the conditions for success. Now, what are the potential obstacles for success? Well, the first thing is that some layers will have significant market power. And they have significant market power as a result of a combination of things. In some layers, you will have strong economies of scale and scope. There will be important network effects. Learning by doing will play. And in those layers where those factors are in operation, you may end up in a situation in which there is either a duopoly or a limited oligopoly, or possibly even the market will tip and you will have some monopoly power. Importantly, these features don't characterize every one of the layers, so some layers will be characterized by lots of market power, others won't have so much market power. And what is the problem with market power if you have market power in several of these layers? Well, that market power compounds, and then you will have several markups building on top of each other, and the result of that is that the overall cost of ownership will be high, and as a result of that, you will have a problem of penetration. Is market power the only obstacle, the only problem? Not really. You are also going to have rent-seeking strategies. And we have seen that in other vertical value chains. Each layer, there will be one or several companies that will want to monopolize that layer. But at the same time, those companies will want to fragment the other layers because they want to make sure that they are the ones that extract rents in the entire value chain. And some of them will decide actually to vertically integrate, if they cannot fragment the other layers, into those layers that are also monopolized. These strategies, these rent-seeking strategies, may be the result of transactions or business strategies that are legitimate in their nature, but there will also likely be lots of regulatory gaming, because another strategy that companies can play in complex vertical chains is to try to limit the market power, the ability of people located at other vertical layers to extract rents. And so there will be all sorts of strategies trying to change laws, regulatory frameworks, incentivize antitrust authorities to intervene at other layers, convince Congress to pass laws that reduce the market power of other layers, this regulatory gaming is going to be in operation. And this is of very significant importance because, as I mentioned before, all these layers are complementary. All of them need to work well in order for the value chain to operate, for IoT to be successful. And anything that any initiative that ends up shifting rents from one player to another may have an impact that is much more than distributional. It may not only be distributional, it may also be of value significance. It may shrink the pie. So initiatives, for example, that seek to move power away from IP holders will have an impact not only in terms of the rents that the IP holders are able to obtain, but also in terms of the whole value that the value chain can generate. So what is the solution to that? What is the role of regulation? Well, I think that before I get to what regulators should do, I think that I want to raise two issues of concern. I think that, or two caveats. The first caveat is that regulators should internalize the complexity of the value chain. And they need to understand precisely the incentives that the various different players have. And when they see that somebody proposes interventions, for example, limiting intellectual property rights or any other action that limits the value that can be generated or appropriated at a vertical layer, they should understand what are the motivations behind that. Are the motivations aligned with those of end users? Then go ahead. But the motivations basically rent shifting motivations, then be careful. Don't intervene. Don't play there because you may end up reducing value. The distributional implications of your intervention may be value detrimental. And in particular, be aware of regulatory gaming. I think that we were heard before about how, in terms of the debate about SEPs, the debate about the patent law in this country has been influenced for rent-seeking reasons. Well, it's not a big surprise. I mean, we have been seeing that in the PC industry and so on and so forth. Beware of regulatory gaming. Now, the second caveat that I wanted to emphasize is there is a lot of focus in terms of legal monopolies, in terms of high concentration, in terms of high margins. That shouldn't be the concern of regulators. That shouldn't be the concern of antitrust authorities. Concentration per se is of some significance, but it's not determinative. High margins, well, that's what we want to some extent, because if companies enjoy high margins, they're going to invest significantly. That's not what we should be concerned about when we try to assess whether a particular layer in that value chain is a layer that is performing well or not, that is helping the success of the entire value chain or not. We should be looking at, is there innovation? Is there business creation? Are there newcomers into this market? What is the extent of product improvements in that layer of the market? Because if we just focus on, okay, in this layer there is legal monopoly, there is some IP rights and therefore some monopoly power, and that's the problem. No, that would be a problem under some circumstances. We need to look at performance rather than focus on structural indicators. And just to conclude these initial opening remarks, of course, we may have to address market power. And addressing market power means not only addressing monopoly power, it means also addressing monopsony power. That's important. We want to make sure that there is competition in the different layers. We want to avoid the creation of horizontal market power, and for that we have horizontal merger control. We may want to stop companies leveraging their market power in one layer of the value chain onto other layers of the value chain. But for that, we already have instruments. What we don't need to do, what we have to avoid, is regulating prices. That would be an absolute mistake, because we don't know what the right price is that incentivizes companies to invest and innovate. And remember, we want to temper market power, but we want to do it, we want to end up in a Goldilocks situation in which companies in each of the layers have enough returns so that they can justify investment. So there are other things that we can do. Let's try to avoid the development of de facto standards in this value chain. Let's try to promote open standardization, voluntary standardization, so that there can be a specialization in the various different layers, so that we don't end up with sub-efficient technology simply because the company that is fostering or advancing its own technologies is the company that has monopolized all the other vertical layers, the vertical layers that involve implementation. I think that we can do all that, and to some extent, and by doing so, helping the development of a healthy, successful value chain. Antitrust has a role. That's what you're hearing from me. But it has a role if it plays within the bounds that has been established over the years, and that tell us that the concern that we should deal with, most importantly, is exclusion, and avoids getting into price regulation, which is where all the problems, I think, that we have observed in recent decisions in various jurisdictions lie. Thank you.
Thank you. Cheetam Sharma.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me on the panel. Yeah, if you can load up the slides, please. Thank you. So I think if you look back historically, we are living in a really extraordinary time, given the confluence of various technologies that are coming together, what we understand to be a fourth industrial revolution. And so these cycles go every 30, 40 years, and we are at the cusp of the start of a new generation, a new wave. And so as an engineer, I think of industries in blocks. And so if you kind of layer what I call the connected intelligence, or other people call the fourth industrial revolution, you have the objects, thinking objects, which are essentially sensors, going from billions of sensors to trillions of sensors. Then you have the connectivity layer, or the access layer, wireless or wireline. And then on top of that, you have data, which drives intelligence, also manages trust and security. And on top of that, you have multi-trillion-dollar industries all around the world. Some have been around for hundreds of years, and others are just getting born. And so it's in this framework I think about how the revenue flows are taking place within the industry, or within multiple industries. Another observation is that historically, with each generation that comes into play, we generally have a 3x jump in revenues generated by the industry. Only we have 2 or 3 data points, but in the past 3 cycles that has proven to be true. With 4G, we're likely to exceed that to probably 4 to 5x, and 5G probably even higher. And each time a new set of technologies and capabilities come into play, you have a disruption process that has a ripple effect across many industries. And typically, new digital capabilities or digital tools come into play, combined with new business models, and it leads to the transformation of industries that sit on the top layer. As an example, you saw with the introduction of smartphones in 2007-8 timeframe, 5 years later, Uber was in full flow, and it started to impact the traditional taxi industry to a point that last year in many cities, the revenue from rideshare started to exceed that of the taxi industry. This was not foreseeable in 2007-8 timeframe. Same thing happened with LTE or broadband. When LTE networks came into play, the video advertising industry, mobile video advertising industry was born, and now it's the fastest growing advertising segment in the media segment. And so that brings me to the point around how should we think about regulations. And so if you think historically, it has been a very access-driven regulatory framework, meaning that all the applications were residing on the access layer, or what I call the connectivity layer. You had voice revenues, you had messaging revenues, you had access revenues or data revenues. And there were some applications which were sitting on top, but very small piece of revenue. Over time, that is shifting. Voice is primarily becoming VoIP, or voice over IP. Messaging is already all IP messaging. And as such, what's going to be left is a highly reliable access layer, but the value has shifted upwards in platform space, in the application space. And so if the regulations don't follow the revenue, you're going to miss the picture, just like we have missed the picture on data privacy issues, and 10 years later, we are coming back to it. I think if we continue to focus on just the access layer, we're going to miss a number of issues that they seem clear that there are going to be issues 10 years down the road, say in AI, in cryptography, in healthcare and whatnot, autonomous vehicles. we are going to miss the big picture 10 years from now. So my suggestion is that we should focus on things or keep track of where the revenue is shifting, and that should guide our regulatory principles. Thank you.
Thank you. David Teese.
Thank you. Well, I think it's, first of all, I have slides, but I'm going to spare you watching them here for you in paper or electronically. But I want to begin by noting that the mobile cluster of industries is the most innovative part of the global economy, and that inside that, 5G is probably the most successful, is likely to be the most impactful innovation of the next decade or two. So we're not dealing with a trivial issue. We're dealing with the real guts of the global economy when we're talking about 5G. And it's not just increasing in upload and download speed this time. We have low latency, which enables real-time control and which facilitates a whole class of other innovations and other business models. Which brings me to a key point. What 5G is what economists call an enabling technology. Some people use the term a general purpose technology. And that meets three criteria. It has economy-wide impacts, and it leads to cumulative innovation. The innovation itself enables other types of innovation. So it builds on itself both vertically and laterally. And that's why it's incredibly important for the economy, because the social spillover benefits are very high. But there's also a fundamental business problem underneath. Anytime you invest in technologies that has impacts across multiple sectors, you're kind of more or less forced into a licensing model. Typically, if you do small things in the innovation space, you can create products or processes and sell those products and processes and the technologies embedded within. You don't need to rely as much on licensing. But when you have enabling technologies, it's absolutely critical that the licensing model works. That's not to say that's the only value capture mechanism, but it turns out almost always to be the most critical one. And so if we're talking about innovation that has big spillovers, getting licensing right is important to encourage the investment that's necessary to support continued innovation. Now, in the history of the world, the enabling technologies or the general purpose technologies that come to mind, things like the microprocessor, things like laser, even the printing press and the steam engine. And in fact, calculations have been done by IHS Markit with respect to 5G, and the impact that they calculate is quite huge, and there are many trillions of dollars. In fact, they estimate that 5G will have an impact that is equivalent to adding India to the global economy. So we're talking trillions of dollars of impact, an enormous social surplus, which brings us to the question that Steve Haber posed to us, is how is all of this captured? And as I said, it's captured primarily, it has to be captured through the licensing models, which puts an onus on the courts to get it right. And this is where antitrust mischief coming in from the side can mess things up. I think the panel this morning was very clear that when you create uncertainty, what happens is markets collapse. So there's an enormous danger here of regulatory failure of one kind or another that would force transactions into the courts, out of the markets. If that happens, I think it's a calamity for the global economy, and it's a calamity for the US, it's a calamity for Europe. It may not be a calamity for East Asia. It may not be a calamity for those that are good at capturing value. So one must always think about creating value and capturing value, and the two don't go hand in hand. You can be the world's best at creating value, like the British have been, but they've been absolutely terrible at capturing it, and as a result, over time, you can't afford to continue to invest. So it's important, particularly since patents are not self-enforcing, that the regulatory environment be correct, and that the courts pay due attention to the fact that patents aren't self-enforcing, and that if they want enabling technology, if they want investors to continue to invest in enabling technologies, you've got to provide a fair return. So do we recognize this as a nation? Ironically, I think there's growing realization that, in fact, this is critical. And in fact, I'll use the Broadcom-Qualcomm merger, where the Treasury came out and said, you know what, we're worried that if we load up Qualcomm with $100 billion of debt, or with a merged company with $100 billion in debt, that this could harm innovation. Well, if high debt can harm innovation because it reduces cash flows, then surely low royalties has exactly the same impact. So the Treasury statement indicates that at least in the highest levels of government, there is now emerging concern that, that the loss of cash flow does harm innovation. And we have to also bear in mind that 5G is not a one-shot innovation. There's an enormous temptation, particularly in antitrust circles, to say, look, we got the technology, now let's get it to the consumer for the least possible cost. But 5G is not here yet. Not only is there significant implementation costs to be incurred, but the 5G standard is likely to go through multiple iterations, and investment will continue in this space for many years to come. So one cannot play the game of saying we've got it, so now let's give it away as cheaply as possible, because won't that benefit the consumer? No, the consumer will be hurt by that, and the economy will be hurt by it, and the coefficients in front of this is very, very large. So I'll stop there and leave it for questions.
Gordon Chang.
Well, thank you, Stephen. David just talked to us about the significance of 5G, and I'm sure everyone in this room agrees. There's also a rather large group of people on the other side of the planet who endorse what David has just said, and those, of course, are the Chinese officials. On Friday, they announced updates to their Made in China 2025 initiative, which is at the heart of their 13th five-year plan. Made in China 2025, as I guess people know, has identified 10 sectors that China wants to dominate, wants to have at least a 70% market share by the year 2025. Of course, part of that is communications. And on Friday, we heard from China that 5G and communications were going to get an even more important role in MC 2025, as the Chinese call it. MC 2025 was announced in 2015, but that was not the first Chinese attempt to actually dominate technology. We saw glimpses of this at the end of the rule of Hu Jintao, 2002 to 2012, with his indigenous innovation product accreditation rules, which attempted to extract technology from foreign companies. We're seeing different ways of doing this, especially in the reign of the current ruler, Xi Jinping, who has generally, if we can look at this, has sort of started to close off the Chinese economy to foreign competitors, especially the Qualcomms of the world. We see state domination of markets, an attack on foreign companies across the board. We just heard from Jorge about how antitrust has a role. We just heard from David about antitrust mischief. One of the ways that the Chinese central government and Communist Party are attacking US companies is using their anti-monopoly law. Which is about a decade old, but it's never really been applied against local state enterprises. We see Xi Jinping over the course of the last 4 or 5 years take already gargantuan state enterprises and put them together into near monopolies and sometimes formal monopolies. But yes, he uses the anti-monopoly law against foreign companies, and since many of you are here from Qualcomm, you know that you've been the target of that. And you've also seen the Chinese government use Apple against Qualcomm by accepting, in January of last year, that case Apple versus Qualcomm under the anti-monopoly law. Normally, the Chinese government doesn't accept cases like this, but it's doing so because it thinks that Apple can club another US company, which is at the heart of US technology. All of this is taking place, of course, in the middle of trade friction. We have President Trump talking about tariffs under Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974. This is to combat Chinese intellectual property theft, which occurs in a number of different ways, not only forced extraction through joint ventures and other means, but also just pure theft. This is an enormous issue for the United States. The IP Commission, in the 2017 update to their 2013 landmark report, talked about how the U.S. each year loses somewhere on the order of $225 to $600 billion Not all of that is to China, of course, but much of it is. And so what we are seeing is the administration trying to struggle with this overriding reality of you've got a pernicious trader at the center of global commerce, which has been using all sorts of means to attack US companies. This really is a struggle not only for innovation, but it is an actual contest for the future. We heard, of course, just now about how this is an extraordinary time, and I can't underline that more, because here is where we fight for our country. Thank you.
Thank you, Gordon. Thank you, other panelists. So let me throw out a question to the panel based on your comments, and hopefully that will motivate questions from the audience, because we'd like to have a back and forth with everybody here rather than just among us. Although, as I like to say, since I'm a professor, what I really like to do is hear myself. You know, when I was 18, I got to college, I realized there was a job somebody would pay me to hear myself talk. I thought, wow, I should do that. So here's the question.
We should all be so lucky, right?
We should all be so lucky, yes. So here's the question. One of the things that I think is becoming increasingly obvious is that the amount of economic surplus, that is value that can be created from 5G and the IoT, is potentially on the scale of the railroad, the steam engine, the internal combustion engine, the factory system. This is a general purpose technology. And what all those other great innovations had in common was that they didn't just dynamize one particular industry, they transformed economies. And they transformed economies both in terms of where things got produced and how they got produced. So the IoT promises to not just be autonomous cars so that I can drive to Stanford while watching reruns of the Golden Girls, but the real impact of this is going to be that there will be dedicated lanes for trucks running, autonomous trucks running at very, very high speeds between cities in the United States and in other places. In terms of logistics, goods are going to move much faster between port, rail, truck, consumer. In production, robots are going to talk to robots because there's now the ability to, the latency speeds are much faster. There's going to be huge gains in productivity and production of all kinds of things, including agricultural goods. So the impact of this is big, and that's the problem. Precisely because the scale of this is so large and the surplus that could be created is so large, as I'm hearing you, gentlemen, it means that the incentives to rent-seek are going to be immense. So that the kind of fighting that one saw, for example, in telecoms, where a few firms that happen to be in my backyard decided to capture certain parts of the federal government and did so rather effectively, is going to be not only, the incentives to do that are not only going to be greater, the opportunities to do it are going to be greater, because it's going to occur across, you're going to get interesting coalitions across many industries where implementers will have incentives to gang up on the producers of the general purpose technologies. So you'll get the kind of political coalitions one often sees in bank regulation. So the question is this. There's sort of two threats. One is other countries are trying to dominate these technologies. But another is within advanced industrial countries, there are going to be regulatory coalitions that are going to work at groups of implementers who will mobilize parts of the consumer population who are going to get mobilized against the technology developers themselves, against the general purpose technology developers. So the question then is this: what set of steps are necessary to prevent that kind of large-scale regulatory capture from taking place? What have we learned from the last go-round of regulatory capture that was one of whose outcome, for example, was the AIA, one of whose outcomes was the eBay decision, one of whose outcomes was certain positions taken by DOJ antitrust. What kind of politics are we going to need in order to remain a competitive economy?
I would propose another wrinkle to what you just described, and which is, unlike past times, we are at a time where three different segments, the sensors, the networks, and the software, they're tightly linked. You cannot take them out from each other. And unless we think holistically about these three elements and how they relate to the various vertical industries, we might miss out on the larger picture. And so I think keeping that in context, I think you have to look at how these three elements impact various vertical industries. So if you take the example of automotive, autonomous vehicles, obviously networks are important, sensors that go into the car are important, the infrastructure that is going to lay it out, that's going to be important, but equally important is the AI black box that might live inside the network or inside the car. And how holistically are we going to think about regulations that touch various elements of the value chain is critical, because if you just focus on the network or the sensors, the network element, value capture might go to some other country.
David?
Well, what's abundantly clear is that intellectual property policy, antitrust policy, and industrial policy will come together. So we can no longer continue with a stupid way of looking at these issues in silos. Anybody that's looking at antitrust that's not also looking at intellectual property and not also looking at industrial policy is not doing their job. So we need interagency cooperation at the governmental level, and we need courts to raise their heads up and see this in a true global systemic context that it is. Otherwise, we're screwed.
Jorge?
I fully agree with David. In addition, I think that we need to understand, as I mentioned during my opening remarks, that this is a multi-layer industry, and that when regulators and when competition authorities tend to look at regulatory and competition policy issues, they tend to look at each of the layers separately, without looking at the full picture, without understanding what are the motivations for certain complaints, and without considering carefully what are the implications of certain regulatory actions. Shifting rents from one layer to another is potentially problematic, and you need to understand that. Which coalitions will form? I think that what we need to investigate, and this may be industrial policy as opposed to IP policy or antitrust policy, we need to look at each of these different layers, and we need to understand which ones are going to be the ones that are likely to result in natural oligopolies and possibly in monopolies, because that will give us information as to where economic power is going to be concentrated. There is where we're going to find the people with the incentive and the ability to try to persuade governments and regulators to fragment other layers, to shift rents away from other layers into their own layers. And in order to determine which are these parts of the vertical chain where market power may emerge, I think that we need to look at network effects, economies of scale, and scope. And I think that that's going to bring us, almost invariably, to focus on data. Because I think that it is the ability to generate data and combine different types of data that is going to generate economies of scale and network effects that are going to be very hard to rival. And those will be the layers that will be where power will be concentrated, and people there will have, as I mentioned before, the ability and the incentive to persuade governments and regulators to fragment other layers or to limit the rents that other layers can generate. And those people are not going to like, in particular, companies that are in favor of open standards, or voluntary standards. They won't like them because those open standards, those voluntary standards imply more competition in their layers, potential for entry. They're going to like vertical integration, and they're going to like de facto standards. And I think that that's what we have seen in the internet value chain. That's what we saw to some extent in the PC in the PC and the PC industry, and that I think that help us understand issues such as browser wars, etc. I think that those are the concerns that we should be focusing on here as well.
Pardon?
Yeah, a domestic area is completely out of my area of expertise, if I have any expertise. But the one thing that we should look at as David mentioned, you look at antitrust policy, industrial policy, all the rest of it, we have to consider the effect of what we do here on the ability of our companies to compete abroad. Because if you look, and I'll take the example that I'm familiar with, of course, China, when you have Qualcomm compete against Huawei, that's not an adequate description of what we're talking about. We're having Qualcomm compete against the Chinese central government, the Communist Party, and the People's Liberation Army, which controls Huawei. And also, you throw in ZTE there, because there is no such thing as antitrust policy that the Chinese government applies against its own companies. So we have to understand that whatever we do in this context, we need our companies to be able to do things abroad that will be able to let them compete effectively against a national government, which has a very, very strong and indeed a much more coercive industrial policy today.
Let me at this point give the audience the opportunity to engage the panel. So the floor is open to questions.
No questions, we can all go home.
Yeah. Corin Wong-Irvin.
My question is primarily for Jorge, but anyone. Talk about, sorry. I was thinking about talking about capturing the value, and in the Federal Circuit's decision in Erickson D-Link, which I think is a great decision in many respects, I was confused by the part that says, the sort of incremental value rule, that you should isolate the value of the SEP from the value of the standard. And so I'm just wondering, as a matter of innovation policy, I've heard some implementers say that, well, all the value of the standard goes to consumers, but we sort of know that the value is less than 1 because we'd have a very different looking demand curve. So just the question, as a matter of innovation policy, sort of how should the value of the standard be divided?
Right. I think that I had a slide where I confronted two different situations. One in which there were two different. There was an implementer, and say there was the IP holder, and they were dividing value 50-50, and the pie was large. And then you had another value division in which one was getting 80 or 90%, and the IP holder was getting 10%, and the value was reduced. Why? Because you have complementarity. And I think that part of the problem with the view that the value generated by standards should go only to one part of the equation is that the whole value gets reduced, because you have a negative impact on the incentives to invest and innovate of the other complementary input. And I think that that's the problem with those kind of suggestions. You can understand them from a rent-seeking perspective. The incremental value rule, it sounds nice, it makes some sense in static models of economic theory, but actually the driver of that rule is to shift revenue, to transfer rents from one part of the vertical value chain to the other. And I think that that's what regulators should be focusing on, trying to understand that these distributional consequences of certain types of interventions end up reducing the overall value. And for that, they need to have a holistic view. They need to understand what are the implications in terms of IP incentives. They need to also understand industrial policy and how that plays.
If there was ever an idea that was very badly founded, it's the idea that you can separate the value of the patents that make a standard work from the value of the standard. It is the intellectual equivalent of asking, are foxes fast because they chase rabbits, or are rabbits fast because foxes chase them? The answer is the rabbits and the foxes co-evolved. It is not a meaningful question in biology to ask how much of rabbit speed is being caused by the foxes chasing them and how much by the slope of the terrain. If you were to ask a biologist that question, I actually did this for fun once, they would look at you like you must be from another planet. When we engage in this fiction that there was a hypothetical competition between two technologies, one of which is an empirical matter, did not exist because it was the standard or the technology that never got adopted, so we can't observe it. When we engage in the fiction that hypothetical, theoretical, non-existent technology competed against the technology that actually, patented technology that got adopted, and then decide as a regulator or a judge or FTC official that we are fix the price. We know better than the market knows, better than bilateral negotiation knows, what the right incentivization for the technology developer is. When we engage in that, we are doing the intellectual equivalent of asking who makes who fast, rabbits making foxes fast or foxes making rabbits fast. It is a kind of intellectual dishonesty that you can find in various DOJ, FTC reports, but it has no economic fundamentals. But I'll tell you what I really think at lunch. Miss.
The Trump administration has been repeatedly claiming China's robbing of Americans' intellectual property, and just last Tuesday, he outlined the tariff list targeting on China's technology field, and it seems, but right now he just softened his words on the trade war. So I'm wondering, what do you think? What are your opinions on the China's trade war and the race to 5G and the critical technologies?
Yeah, I don't know if it's profitable to try to figure out what President Trump's motivation is. But I do think, though, that there are certain aspects that transcend Trump. And actually, you look at essentially the United States and China, and long term, there is this competition. And this competition's not going to go away. It's regardless of who's going to get elected in 2020. But we are going to see, as we've seen over the last year or so, that American political opinion is starting to understand the challenge that China poses, not only to our companies, but to our society as a whole. And this competition will there'll be more friction. I think that we're going to see a much different environment a year, 2 years, 3 years down the road, as we see a Chinese political system that is leaving the U.S. no choice.
Sir.
Gene Quinn from IP Watchdog. I couldn't agree more, Steve, with what you were just saying about, well, I won't even try and summarize it, but what I would just try and do here, maybe this is a comment if you all want to address it, I think it's more of a challenge to the industry, really. When the topic of standard essential patents comes up, my eyes glaze over and I really just want to carve them out with a dull spoon. I mean, partly because I think as a group we have so hampered ourselves from the get-go by conceding the linguistic high ground on virtually everything that we debate on every issue, and we lose before we even open our mouths. And standard essential patents is just right now is just one of them. That's one we're talking about. Because when we talk about standard essential patents, well, that then has to mean that there's some patents that aren't essential. And it also has to mean that if these patents are essential, then you are just using them to block what people need. And no good can possibly come of that. So I would love for us all to get together again and have something like this where we debate what you just brought up. And how can we have this conversation in a way that we can break through and discuss it so that, because what you just said, Steve, everybody in the room gets, but how can we get people who aren't in this room, who don't necessarily agree with us, or maybe they don't not want to agree with us, but they don't know enough. How do we educate them to understand that it's not about the fox and the rabbit? You know, that it really is something that we have to talk about in order to educate and get the point across.
I think that there's a key educational point to be made. And it doesn't require technical knowledge. It requires simply understanding that innovation is not manna from heaven. It doesn't just drop down on us And some of us happen to be sitting in the right place, and we get it, and we can then charge other people for it. That's the implicit theory in so much of the innovation economics literature, and in what is taught in law schools, that innovation is manna from heaven. Rather, as Jorge's made clear and as David's made clear, there's a value chain, and that part of what's going on is that some firms are incentivized to innovate and will invest in doing so because they're trying to capture part of the final demand that is the final surplus. It's not a difficult concept, but it's one that I think has been pushed aside by 20 years of writing, particularly from the Legal Academy. There's a wonderful paper I want to encourage everybody here to read by Jonathan Barnett called Has the Academy Led Patent Law Astray? It's coming out in the Berkeley Technology Law Review, and it's well worth a read. I know David wants to get on this topic.
Well, look, the point is that we have to get people to understand that this is about investment. Royalty rates, returns have to be such to encourage the flow of investment necessary to keep innovation going. People get tied up in their underpants on all kinds of different things, but at the end of the day, there's got to be incentives in there, and that's a very simple proposition, and it gets lost in complex antitrust issues, the division of the rents, but at the end of the day, if you're not providing incentives for investment, you lose the game.
If I may add, I think that an important dimension in this debate is, if you think in terms of the public opinion cares about what? At the end of the day, it cares about things of what is the total cost of this product. When I buy a smartphone, what is that I have to pay in order to get this functionality? They may also care about issues such as employment, et cetera, and who is employing. And I think that the problem that IP holders have is that, A, they are somewhat remote, distant from the pricing decisions that eventually, of the products that eventually consumers get, and also that there are industries that are not employment intensive compared to the implementers. I think that the issue that I think that we would need to debate is, if you're paying $1,000 for an iPhone, how much of that is responsibility, is the cost of the intellectual property that is behind that technology? And how much is the result of market power at other layers in the vertical value chain? When you are paying, whatever amount of dollars for the app that you like, and it happens to be not one of those that is free, how much of that is the result of the intellectual property that makes it possible for that app to deliver, for example, because you want to post photographs, et cetera, and how much is the result of the 30% tax that Google Play or the Apple Play Store impose on the app developers so that they can distribute their apps through their Apple stores, their app stores. I think that those are the questions that I think that perhaps the IP industry has failed to communicate clearly to the end users. Because frankly speaking, I think I know the numbers, and I think that the numbers tell me that it is not because of the cost of the IP that apps cost what they cost, or that high-end smartphones cost what they cost. And I think that this is a debate that is going to emerge in the IoT industry as well. Because eventually success means, obviously lots of investment, et cetera, but success for IoT would mean that there is penetration, that the technology gets diffused. And that's going to be a function of prices. And the rent-seeking game is played by blaming the high prices on the other layers of the vertical chain, whereas at the same time trying to disguise that it's your market power that is generating that extra cost. And that's relatively easy if you're running platforms in which you can always claim that there is one side of the market where you are selling things for free. And putting the emphasis on that side of the market, ignoring the rents that you make on other sides of the market.
I think, Steve, coming back to your the initial set of slides with lights going back, I think if you look forward, I think it's clear that countries who are able to productize 5G and application layer faster than others, a lot of the economic activity will move in those countries. So whether it's manufacturing, it's creation of intellectual property around AI, or the new side of chipsets or sensors or whatever it might be, clearly production will move wherever there's more opportunity. And so I think that's why it's critical at multiple layers for governments, especially for large countries, to have an industrial policy discussion with the private sector.
David Kapos.
Staying on that theme, and a question back to Professor Haber. So you showed those brilliant simulations at the beginning, including going back to 1500 when China and India were, I think it's fair to say, dominant on the world playing stage, and then something happened. Talk more about what happened that caused them to fade. And I think that perhaps takes a question or the comment that you just got back in time. Why was it that they didn't continue to succeed, whereas Europe and the US and others came on?
So it's a great question. It's been something actually I've been working on now for over a decade. And I think I'll condense a decade of work into the following short answer. If you were to look at the world in 1500, there's not a lot of private property rights anywhere. There's sets of overlapping rights, both in Europe and in China and in India, and pretty much anywhere you look. The concept of private property is very weak. There's certainly no concept in 1500 of intellectual property. There's a concept of royal monopoly and privileges everywhere. One of the things that happens across comparing Europe, India, and China is that particularly in India under the Mughal Empire and China under a succession of emperors going back to the Ming, there's political centralization, and the politically powerful see the threat that is posed by the emergence of classes of wealthy entrepreneurs, merchants, and other commercial interests whose success in business will prove a threat to their control of the society, to their political power. This is most famously captured in Ming China when the emperor says, just burn the fleet. So there had been immense 800-strong Chinese convoys traveling the Indian Ocean. And out of that, a merchant class emerging, and the Ming emperor simply says, we're not doing this anymore. Burn the fleet, and I want people to move away from the coast into the inland. It's all about political control. What happens, on the other hand, in Europe is a very slow, and I want to underline the word slow, emergence or transformation of the property rights system, moving away from overlapping property rights to a notion of private property, both in land first, but then private property rights in all kinds of assets, including financial assets, and including by the mid-18th century, before the Industrial Revolution, a patent system coming to exist in England by the 1730s. Not centrally planned, incidentally, by anybody, but emerging out of a set of decisions by courts as entrepreneurs go to courts to enforce what they claim are their patent rights, their intellectual property rights. And by the 1750s, British courts are treating these patents as a tradable intellectual property right. The United States picks up on the British system. Our 1790 Patent Act, which American historians are very proud, we often tend to forget that it's based on the British system. All we did was drive down the cost dramatically, that is by 95% of getting a patent, and we made it an administrative rather than a parliamentary procedure. It's one of the things that drives the US economy in the 19th century. So the short answer to the question is what happened? Political centralization got in the way of property rights, and one key kind of property right it got in the way of was intellectual property. Here I'll just mention one other thing. If you think about where in the medieval period, where a lot of the wonderful inventions of the world were created. They're not coming out of Europe. They're coming out of, ice cream, for example, is an 11th century invention of Arabs in Sicily. Gunpowder is an invention of China. But the ability to turn those products into commercially viable enterprises that can generate value for the society requires a property right. And what was lacking underneath those inventions were the property rights that could turn them into commercializable products that generated wealth for those societies.
Yeah, the destruction of the treasure fleet that Stephen just talked about is the most dramatic evidence of China turning inward. But it's not the only one during the imperial period of about 2,000 years. We've seen this a number of times where a Chinese emperor, for one reason or another, Stephen mentioned one of those reasons, decided that it was time for China to close up. And inevitably after that, in every single case, the Chinese economy slowly eroded and then failed. And then, of course, they started to open up again. The whole concept of, and what we're seeing today, is a replay of that, but for very different reasons. We have Xi Jinping, who obviously wants to be an absolute ruler. He says that he has to have absolute control of the Communist Party, and the Communist Party has to have absolute control over society. Not just politics, but society. And so we're seeing a closing of the Chinese mind. And part of this, I think, is drawn not in the case in the past when you talked about destruction of property rights, but by just this overweening ambition of a small group of people, including Xi Jinping, of course, to dominate society. And so we are seeing the same dynamic. He didn't start it started under Hu Jintao, but it's certainly accelerated. And this time I think it's being drawn by arrogance and overconfidence. There's a lot of hubris today if you read and listen to what the Chinese say. And of course, all of this has implications for every American company, every foreign company, and indeed, even private Chinese entrepreneurs are the target of what US companies are now feeling in China.
Keith Mallinson.
Thanks. So my question really is about the practicalities of licensing in the 5G era. Previously, for example, in mobile phones, it was relatively straightforward in terms of licensing the intellectual property on a bilateral basis, because maybe there are dozens of licensors and hundreds or maybe up to thousands of licensees. But with the layering that you're describing here, this massive ecosystem, you got the connectivity layer, you got data, you got the applications, different kinds of devices. So it's a real kind of bird's nest or spaghetti of connections and relationships and such like. There's a concern out there that there needs to be transparency. There's uncertainty in the ecosystem of how much they're going to have to pay and who they've got to pay it for. So on the assumption that even where the pricing of the intellectual property is fair, what are the mechanisms that are going to be able to deliver this? And where bilateral approach maybe not, I would suggest, maybe is maybe not sufficient to make it all happen here in 5G with the enormity of what we have.
David?
I'll try and address part of it. You're quite right. It's going to be an incredibly complex circumstance because there's so many verticals that are implicated. It's not just one or two. It's going to be hundreds, if not thousands, of verticals and product areas. So there's two issues. There's what's fair and reasonable, and there's also what is non-discriminatory. Needless to say, I think they should be left to negotiation on a bilateral basis, but with respect to the principle of what's discriminatory, I think the basic notion that, similarly situated firms should pay similar royalties is the starting point. And I would predict that we're going to need some new conceptual apparatus to think about what similarly situated means. And there is, in the business strategy literature, a concept of strategic groups. And I think we need something like that to think about which firms are meaningfully competing, who are the head-on competitors that you're facing. We haven't had to deal with that very much in FRAND and RAND issues so far. But I think in the future, because of the points that you make, this is going to be something that's going to require some conceptual development and understanding by the courts.
I think I.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, and then Cheatham, go ahead.
So it's a very important question and a very good question and a very difficult one. I think that in terms of thinking about what is the optimal licensing solution in a multi-layer industry so complex as this, I think that there are a number of considerations that one would have to consider. First is the issue of monitoring, because in order to be able to license, you need to be able to monitor usage. You need to have an idea about who is using the technology more than and who is using the technology less, and that may tell you that you should go in the direction of in the vertical chain to the ultimate layer of implementation. But the difficulty here, as opposed to, I think, in the smartphone industry, is that it is not clear that it's going to be that ultimate layer of implementation, the one that appropriates most of the rents that are generated by this technological revolution, because perhaps the rents are going to be appropriated at the application layers and the data layers. And so the question is then, shouldn't you go there? It is obviously a bad idea to try to license at all levels of the vertical chain. That would generate immense transaction costs and would generate discrimination issues. So you have to choose the layer, all layers where action is going to take place. And I think that, to me, there are three ultimate implementation things in terms of components or applications. And I'm torn to give you an answer, because I think that some factors, monitoring points in one direction, but I think that the value is likely to end up with at the application layers or the data-intensive layers, and therefore I'm not sure what the answer is. So sorry that I'm not clarifying the issue, but I hope that I'm shedding some light into the difficulty of the question that you just raised.
Do you think there will be a different solution and maybe a different solution for one vertical sector versus another?
It may well be, because this trade-off that I was mentioning before between monitoring versus value may be different in different sectors.
Cheatham.
Yeah, just make it quick. I think we might start with realizing that the definition of traditional, what we define as a market, has completely changed, and having a framework to understand competition in the new context. And so we can no longer say that competition in the operator segment is this. I think competition is coming from everywhere. So we need a framework that compares the market power of, say, Amazon with market power of AT&T. Right now, we don't have tools to compare market powers of people who might be intersecting, but don't quite overlap with each other. I think the second area of probably further research is around focusing on verticals that we now know and understand. So say automotive might be a good one to start, understand the stack, and then see where the value is being created and what value needs to be captured to understand what licensing regimes might be needed. There are certain areas and industries which will evolve that we have no idea how they might evolve over the next decade, but probably a start would be the ones that we understand today.
So I'm going to have to wrap us up here. I know we have Congressman Stivers coming in, but I want to take a few seconds to thank all the panelists for a fascinating panel, and to thank them for their interventions, and thank the audience for their great questions. Thank you.